Well, I'm delighted today that Dr. Brian Stiller, who is the Global Ambassador for the World Evangelical Alliance, is back with us again. We did a radio program a few days ago, and I was profoundly impacted by what he shared, and I wanted Brian to come back and share it with you as well. So, Brian, thank you for being here today. Always glad that you're with us, and you're keeping well?
We're very well. Warm and enjoying the occasional rain, a great gift.
Well, Brian, part of your ministry takes you all around the world, and I know that COVID has kind of clipped your wings for a little bit, but you're still staying in touch with the global church. And just tell us in a sentence or two what all you're doing worldwide. And who is the World Evangelical Alliance?
There are three out of the 2.4 billion Christians, there are three major world Christian communities. The Vatican, the Roman Catholics, is about 1.2. The World Council, which includes the Eastern Orthodox, is about 500 million. And evangelicals comprise about 650 million Christians worldwide, which is about 25% of the world Christian population. The World Evangelical Alliance is not a Vatican to the evangelicals, but it's a global center. I serve as global ambassador. I travel to many countries, conferences. We're helping younger leaders, right? That kind of thing.
You know, Brian, you see so many amazing things happening, but you also see some of the difficulties that believers are going through and the atrocities in other countries. One would think that it would never happen in Canada, but we're dealing with a matter called the residential schools, and we're grieving with our Indigenous brothers and sisters. The subject strikes close to home for you. Talk to me about that first, before we talk about your global travels. Let's deal with Canada.
It is a subject of enormous grief and sorrow. I am a too late comer to the sorrowing of it, and I wonder why. I was raised in Saskatchewan in the 40s and 50s, which had a large Indigenous population, both full-blooded and part-blooded Indian. I was aware of them. They lived on reservations, most of them, at least I thought. There were some who lived in the city of Saskatoon and Regina, but they tended to be those who were struggling with the various forms of addiction and living in the more difficult, poorer areas of the city. But I never, in my history, in my learning, in my encounter, ever understood the depth of their history and their culture, their language, and their essential people. I didn't understand that. It was almost incidental to us. We were covered with a notion, a cultural bias towards the European community as being preeminent and thus should be the one that the culture assigns itself to. And I didn't know of residential schools. Even though I lived in Saskatchewan, I don't recall ever hearing of them. It was something I learned of later. So we didn't have many friends who were Aboriginal, the odd person in school, but they generally were demeaned.
So as you think about what shaped you as you're growing up, how do you think we as Canadians, I mean, we've been shaped similarly. I had similar things, even though I didn't live in Saskatchewan. We thought of our Indigenous brothers and sisters in a demeaning way. How do we respond with the horrific things that we're reading about, the people that have been killed, the children that have been abused, violated, and their lives taken? How do we respond as Christians?
Well, let me just kind of finish my history. And when I was with the Evangelical Fellowship in the 90s, we realized that this was a growing issue. And so I remember we had a 3-day circle of about 8 or 12 people, and we listened to their stories just hour after hour. And it was so powerful hearing them as they told about being ripped away from their parents. And by them not being parented, they never knew what it was to parent. So they said, you talk about dysfunctional families. We never knew what family was because we were torn from our families. And so I began to understand and feel the depths of their sorrow, even though I suspect that at the best that was somewhat superficial. And so now we end up today.
And what do we do today? I mean, you told a story the other day about a gentleman who was taken from his family. Tell me that story. Tell our viewers that story.
He was 8 years of age, and the government official came out into the bush where they were living and literally took him from the family tent and took him to a residential school. And there he lived, frightened, alone, was not allowed to speak his language, could not use his various behaviors of native culture. He was sexually abused. And then he would go back for the summer with his parents, but then he was now foreign, and he was seeing his parents differently because he had been instructed that native Aboriginal indigenous people were inferior, and so he had this growing inferiority.
Wow.
And his father was broken, and he ended up on the city drunk, so dysfunctional, because he had been robbed of his rightful family, his rightful heritage, and we, as the European invaders, which we thought we were kind of refugees. We were people, migrants coming for a better land and building this land so it could become something, never realizing that we took people out of their abode, removed them from their sense of life and identity, and it gave them nothing in return. So today we are there, and as a person being born back in the early 40s in Saskatchewan, I ask myself today, am I responsible? Well, in a sense, I'm not. I'm not responsible for the government having done that. Now, you can argue with me, and I'm not prepared to spill a lot of blood on that battlefield because I could be wrong. But what I think I'm not wrong about is that today, if I don't own it, then I become complicit in that which went on. So if I'm not complicit because of my age, and I'm not complicit necessarily because I'm of a Swedish heritage, if I don't own what our country did, then in a sense I am unpatriotic. I am rejecting the nature of our country, pretending it didn't and doesn't exist, and I live within a cocoon of my own choosing and my own self-interest today, keeping out from that cocoon the struggles and the sorrows and the deep pain of people today who look back onto their grandmothers and their great-grandmothers and great-grandfathers whose grave is in the shallow soil of those residential schools. And that suffering and pain is ripping at the heart. And somehow, as a white Canadian of many years standing, I have to accept complicity because of my heritage.
Brian, you've said so much. We got about 30 seconds. Can you give me a couple things to hold on to move forward? What would you say to the church? We have 30 seconds.
Open your heart and pray. I mean, deeply pray. Deeply pray.
Yeah.
Make friends of an Aboriginal. Read their books. There's some great books out there. Find ways of putting funds, your investment, into people and into ministries and into agencies that will help. And find a way to publicly declare your sense of sorrow with our brothers and sisters. That's the gospel. It's the Good Samaritan. It's the story. The two things we're told to do: love God, love your neighbor. This is neighbor love.
You've been listening to Dr. Brian Stiller, the Global Ambassador for the World Evangelical Alliance. Brian, thank you for sharing your heart and stirring mine as well. Thank you.
Thank you.